I'm going to start with you. You just had one of your graph the pages up there was all of the companies that have had these huge investments, right, from wherever, from the world this year. Before, when we were talking to Dr. Wood, he was talking about Epic being rolled out in Mayo and how clunky it is in some places. And gosh, I hope we can really reshape Epic. I didn't see Epic up there. I'm not here to make a commercial for Epic, but I do want to get your sense of how confident you are that where the money is going, where we saw that list of companies, is actually the right match for where the biggest demand is right now in terms of meeting current, present, day-to-day. I mean, doctors use Epic every single day. They may not know about some of these apps because they're up and coming. How are we meeting the day-to-day, today problems? How confident are you that we're spending the money in the right place?
So I think that's a good question. I think that a lot of these are parallel processes that are going to be playing out. I think that you're seeing advances kind of happening in an uneven way, and I think that's just the way innovation happens. It's not this sort of necessarily even march. But I would say that what's happening now is that the legacy systems like Epic and others are also aware of the environment in which they operate. And I think the newly funded companies are aware that the Epics of the world aren't going anywhere anytime soon. I think there might have been that expectation maybe 10 years ago. So what I am seeing through architectures like FHIR and that are bringing the ability for new tech to plug into an Epic, you are seeing a lot more of that go on, where it's not about, it's either Epic or it's one of these sort of newly funded companies. It is really a lot more of the integration. So even with Lyft, which is a transportation service,
right,
they're integrating with the EMR. Flatiron, which was bought by Roche, started out as an extension of an EMR for cancer patients. So I think we're seeing a lot of that coming together now.
Amy, there's a question here, shifting a little bit here from the audience, finding the connection between the behavioral health institutions and prisons fascinating. How might your insight on the design translate to healthcare delivered in prisons and or strategies for reducing trauma for imprisoned youth? Have you gone into that avenue with your company?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, the word prison coming up so much in the research that we did with behavioral health facilities, as I mentioned, was totally unprompted by us. But I have to confess, it's one of the reasons that we got interested in this kind of partnership with NMSHOF to look at behavioral health in the first place. As I mentioned, with the memorial, we've been doing work with Brian Stevens and the EJI, and they do a lot of work around justice, the criminal reform system, and we also had just recently completed a one-year research project with the Vera Institute of Justice, which was really looking at prison spaces in the US, understanding how they came to be and identifying some solutions or ways out. And as part of that, we had gone to Scandinavia to look at some of the ways that they're approaching incarceration there and the spaces there. And we were left with that big idea that, here how we do it is incarceration is about penalizing people. It's about kind of defining you by, in Brian Stevenson's words, the worst thing that you've ever done. It's about treating you like you're a criminal. And as part of that, we are not creating trauma-informed spaces in prisons. We are further traumatizing people. And in Scandinavia, on the other hand, we see spaces that if you look at them, you wouldn't necessarily know they're a prison. The whole idea in some of those spaces is how can we leverage design to create these restorative spaces. If we know that people are going to go back out into the world, we don't want them to be further traumatized. We want them to be more centered when they leave. And so for me, I think it's really difficult to intervene in behavioral health spaces. It's difficult to intervene in the in prison space design, but there's, as you mentioned, I think in the question, there's a huge overlap. So not only is the furniture, a lot of the furniture the same, the people are sometimes the same, and the places are sometimes the same. So there's a huge number of prisoners who are being treated for behavioral health, and you have all these like in-between facility types like forensic units. And for me, the real opportunity is to think across scales, but perhaps starting with the smallest one, furniture, which is maybe a way of thinking about design as a Trojan horse that can go in and try to invert some of the assumptions people have about, the only way that we can do it is by further penalizing people, and that restoring things isn't really an option.
Yeah. Sounds like you'd like to get your hands on designing a prison, maybe, potentially. That would be an interesting project, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful to think about that and the overlap with health and this broad notion of healing.
I think it was the New York Times article about the prison in Norway with its quote-unquote worst offenders has no fences. They live in this space. But it's important for health because the 3 largest mental health facilities in the country are jails.
Yeah.
Cook County Jail, LA County, and Rikers Island.
Yeah.
And so this very much works and is important to transform. Kathleen, you mentioned with this design and with what we're doing here that we're not just patients, right? We are consumers. And then you gave the example of the insulin product that's being, that doesn't exist yet, but that you're one of the, but there is something to the psyche of that statement that we're not just patients, we are consumers. There is something, I think, in my gut that sounds yucky, especially if I'm a doctor.
Right.
Right? This is about a bigger mission than consumerism. How do you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of that slide that I shared where if you talk to a doctor, they'll say, are you kidding? Like, why are we thinking about what it looks like? And what it looks like is sort of this misunderstanding of what design is. Design is this incredibly powerful way of working. The process of design has always been deeply user-centered. It's always been incredibly systemic. And we have frameworks and tools and methods for uncovering and understanding human behavior. So it's a myth, the notion that design is purely about consumerism and white stripes at the end of on the racing car. It used to be that design was the bane of everyone's existence, the final thing that happened in the flow of a process within an organization. And it is no longer. The most successful companies in the world are design-led organizations. The example I showed was Google, arguably one of the greatest companies right now, most successful companies. And the mission being, let's bring great design to the world to be more commonplace. So to ignore not the look and feel of consumerism aspect of design, but really the process, the mindset of uncovering what people do. That would be a mistake in healthcare. Such an opportunity.
Where can you design in the work you do to address, and Indu brought this up in her presentation too, but where in your work do you feel you can best design to address social determinants of health?
Oh. So in design, and the design mind, the way that we work, we use a lot of very systemic frameworks. And so, for example, when we're designing anything, we think about 5 human factors. And those 5 human factors aren't just physical. They're physical, emotional, cognitive, cultural, and social. All 5. So we're thinking about all 5. So it isn't a question of where can you make the most social impact with design, or how might you address the social issues. If we were going to address a social issue, we would address that issue incredibly systemically by thinking about all 5 of those human factors.
I've heard the phrase sick buildings, Amy. Is that a thing? Do you think that's a logical, accurate description of some buildings, that they are sick? And do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah,
Like this phrase of sick buildings.
I think the term sick building refers specifically to the kind of like microbiome
asbestos kind of stuff, yeah.
But I think that in general, when it applies to healthcare, it's true that the buildings kind of mirror maybe the systems that they are set to serve, which in general treat people like they are sick and they need to be fixed. And I think for me, this is one reason why I find the topics of how we design for birth and for death on opposite end of the spectrum is really compelling, because these are moments where people aren't exactly sick. I gave the talk today about hospital spaces, but I think in general we would advocate for a lot of the approaches taken in yesterday's presentation about moving healthcare out of facilities. But at the same time, they're always going to need to be there. So how can we design them so that they don't treat people and define people, to your earlier comment, by their disease or sickness? And in these cases where people aren't sick at all, how can we create the frameworks for care to be more human and delivered with more grace?
Yeah, and assuming the hospital you were in for those 2 months didn't have asbestos problems, and so I'm not referring to that use of the term. But do you think the hospital you stayed at was a sick building?
I think if part of it's framing. As I mentioned, if I had a bad experience, I think I would have remembered it as a sick building.
Mm-hmm.
All of these experiences that we have in healthcare spaces, when I go to an outpatient well visit, it's maybe a little annoying to me that I have to sit there on the table. I never know when somebody's going to come in or not. But those experiences, they kind of fade away because they don't matter that much. The experiences that matter are the ones that lodge in your mind. And I think I'm not left with the view of that building being a sick building insofar as I really appreciated and respected the amazing care that I was given. Mm-hmm. But all of the efforts that the clinicians went to, I think, were in a way undermined by the building, which suggested something contrary to the real effort that they put to try to make it personable and try to make it really about supporting my needs. And I think that if it had ended up as a bad story, that these moments really lodge in our minds as these poignant contradictory settings where it's like, I was in this moment and yet I felt so alone, or I was in this moment and I remember this puddle on the floor that said this. So it's all, I'm glad that it was a happy story.
Oh, I am too. Indu, as you think about this, and I loved what Kathleen talked about human-centered design, it does sound like a lot of the companies you're talking about have that frame in their mind, even if the design is something more technical, more appy, more software, versus a chair, versus the product that I hold. How much of what you were talking about, that roster of companies, is focused on either this architecture side of things in that design versus the more product design that Kathleen was talking about? It sounds like those companies you were talking about are more doing the kinds of things Kathleen is doing versus Amy, but I'd love you to clarify that if I'm wrong.
I don't want to speak for all technology companies out there, but I would say by and large this movement of digital health, sort of folks who've come to transform over the last 8 years and people following Health 2.0, it was almost as if it was an act of opposition to the way design in healthcare was done for so many years. And they were just coming at it from a technology standpoint.
Right.
But this idea of the user experience, in fact, the very first Health 2.0 conference was called User-Centered Healthcare. And the whole idea was that technology shouldn't be this kludgy, awkward thing that makes you depressed and burnt out and like my sister who's an ER doc, crying in the middle of the ER, not because she lost a patient, because she lost all of her data and the record she spent, 18 hours putting in. So the technology world that I'm talking about, I think, is responding to bad design and is saying that it's not that technology is a solution, but hopefully, if done right, it's a connective tissue between the physical environment, the human interface, and how can we build tools that allow us to integrate these environments and improve the experience. I think that's what we're talking about, is how do we improve the experience across the continuum of care, not just for patients, but for everybody that's part of that experience, which includes all healthcare workers, et cetera. So I would say that if you look at that stack that I mentioned of technology, the way we're describing it, from storage to transactions to exchange to analytics to the interface layer, I would say they all have to work together. And at every single point, it has to be, whether you're down at the storage level, it has to be, well, what is relevant to capture for that end user up top? If it's at the analytics level, well, what insight do I need? If it's the interface level, what's the fastest, easiest, most natural way for me to interact with this technology?
But it's interesting, isn't it,
Yeah.
right? Because Amazon was raging against the machine when it went after bookstores, right? And then what happens? Amazon buys Whole Foods, and Amazon opens its own bookstore. So even the digital company of Amazon, at some point in its history, came back around to brick and mortar, at least at some scale. And I would sense, and I've not been inside one of these Amazon stores, that the way they designed it was different, because they had that digital experience. And it does make me wonder if everything you're talking about then does come back. Maybe some of these companies then do dip their toe, the way Amazon did, back into the design that Amy's talking about.
I think, so, when we described the inversion of the stack, it wasn't that, okay, so now technology is just sort of helping care delivery do its job the way it's always done its job. I think we're saying that there's a whole new animal out there, which is a technology-enabled care delivery mechanism, but it might look completely differently, even if we are going back to brick and mortar, and many of these are. So Iora Health and Parsley Health and many others are brick and mortar as well as technology, and those full stack companies are hiring their own doctors. They're saying it's taking too long to integrate with existing. I'm going to hire doctors, I'm going to build clinics, I'm going to do what I need to do around the way I've designed technology and information for that human-centered outcome. So I think that you're absolutely right. I think we are going to see a coming full circle to how physical, spaces are designed, but I think the starting point will be very different.
Kathleen, you mentioned United Airlines and
Sure.
the whole process there, not just buying the ticket, but then
Right.
that whole other experience that they're not capitalizing on. What can healthcare be learning from a company like United or other industries like the airline industry?
So much. Looking outside of healthcare.
Yeah.
It's really important, borrowing from other industries. We're constantly doing that. And I share the United example in order to give that example. Last year at the Mayo Clinic, I think Douglas Wood, I'm not going to quote it right exactly, but he said, healthcare needs to stop focusing on what it can do and what it's already done, but needs to start focusing on what it could do. And in order to focus on what you can do, or what you could do, in that example that I showed the loop, it's all about looking at the behaviors that were unsupported. It's all about not focusing on that specific problem to fix, and letting the user behavior uncover opportunities for you. Really defining what could you do.
But is it, for example, just use Mayo, would it have then been Mayo's job, if they'd been more forward-thinking, to have invented Uber
Yeah.
or Lyft?
Absolutely. I think so. And it sounds silly, doesn't it?
Yes.
Right? But it shouldn't. Because again, you mentioned, it sounds kind of icky to say that,
Yeah.
that patients are consumers, right? But we are. And to ignore that is to ignore what it means to be understanding people as human.
In our final minutes here, Amy, I just have some personal reflections because your company was involved in the lynching memorial in Alabama, which I actually happened, I was present for the opening weekend because I was doing some reporting around it for when I was working at the radio station. And it is such a solemn, poignant, powerful place to be. And it's a very moving place. And this is a very awkward thing to say, and I don't want to be insensitive, but I then think about the fact that, as I noted, this is just my most recent example, my cat died, and I was in this kind of stoic, the people were great, but this room was kind of stoic. And the importance of being in a place like that memorial, and I don't want to equate lynching with, my cat dying. I'm trying not to be insensitive there, but there was something about the feelings I felt and that I felt that it was right to be in that place, in that memorial, versus the feelings I didn't feel in that room as my cat died. And I'm not suggesting that I should have had my cat die at the memorial, but like, how do we merge those designs, right? So that the feelings of somberness and solemnity are apt, you know, in their place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, for me, those experiences, like the ones that you've talked about in the memorial, are about creating the atmospheres and environments that help us slow down and pull out of our own, you know, what we're focused on, what we have to get done, be able to step back and look around us and understand, you know, what ties us together and what holds us apart. And the places that we remember as meaningful in those ways are not often you know, experiences that we would have in a health facility. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think that, you know, this notion of transaction has come up a few times, and each of us has different kind of pressures and weights on our shoulders. From the patient is trying to go in there, deal with something that they've never dealt with, your cat dying, it's something personally tragic. The doctor's coming in from, or the nurse or the clinician is coming in from a totally different vantage point, which is maybe this is the 50th cat that they've seen that day die.
Right.
And how can design help both of those parties come together, find common ground, and have a kind of shared moment where you're experiencing your thing, and we create the space and the kind of understanding of a sense of like domain that maybe helps the clinician who has to experience that day in and day out to step back and remember that you are not the 50th patient, that you are a person, and this is the kind of meaningful and tragic for you, and help them connect with you emotionally and personally. And that idea of moving from transaction to exchange and relationships and trust is the difference between those two experiences, I think, that we need to design for.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being here. Amy Schall, Kathleen Brandenburg, and Indu Sabaya. Thank you so much for your perspectives and thoughts. It was really very interesting. And let's hear it for our speakers here during this session.